We have today Dr. Christi Borders and Nikki
Michalak,
who are going to be talking to us about students who are deaf and hard of hearing with additional disabilities. So please welcome them.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see many familiar faces after last year and a couple students that I've had at ISU. So I'm Christi Borders. I am in the Deaf Ed program at Illinois State University, and my primary research area is on deaf kids with additional disabilities. It's my favorite thing in the entire world. I love the puzzle. I love the complexity. We've decided that it is still definitely uncharted territory. There's not a lot out there in the research, but you all know there's a whole lot out there, right? Otherwise, you all wouldn't be here. There are some really complex deaf kids out there in our classrooms right now. And so at ISU, we have a team of researchers who are very interested in this topic. And so I'm on that team as the side of deaf education to bring in that deaf ed perspective of, okay, this is a great intervention, but how do we do that for deaf kids? How does the deafness tie into that? And then we have Nikki Michalak.
and I wear the ASD hat. For the past 10 years at ISU, we had a grant. We no longer have it anymore. Through the Illinois State Board of Education, the Illinois Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project. So on that grant, we worked
You're gonna kill
with
the interpreter.
families and we worked with teachers, and we would go into schools and homes and build supports for kiddos that have an autism spectrum disorder. So I wear the ASD hat.
We do. So I feel very fortunate to be at a place where someone that works with ASD is very interested in also hearing about how autism looks for our kids, or how just any complex learning need looks for our kids. How many of you all were here at our first training last year? Several of you. Excellent. How many of you, if you weren't at last year's, were at the pre-conference at IFE last year? Okay, so there's a few. Most of you saw our presentation last year, and that's awesome because we didn't want to redo the same thing. You all don't want to redo the same thing, right? So we are going to kind of move beyond where we ended last year and go into some really new information. It's very exciting for us to stand here this morning and tell you that we're going to be able to give you some literally hot off the press information. We're going to give you information on the new DSM-5, so the new diagnostic tool for autism. And we're also proud to tell you that just last week, the new evidence-based practices for autism were released. And so those are all in this presentation today, and we will give a very quick skim over some of what evidence-based practices are currently out and established in the field. So we will go ahead and get started. Sound good? And you all know we came from Bloomington, and we're going to get real snow today. So we will try and finish up right at 2:30 because we are expected to get about 8 inches of snow tonight down south. So we want to be able to get home safely.
We want to stay on the highway instead of off of the highway, which we have already been off the highway
We've already
once.
been in the ditch this morning. So we are very glad to be here safely. We got ran off the road by a semi this morning and
almost made it into oncoming traffic.
Calmly handled that situation amazingly. So as I said, we are going to consider this uncharted territory. We're going to do this at a Prezi today, and so your notes look a little different. And I'm sorry that they're not the PowerPoint notes with those nice little lines, but we tried to put 4 slides on each one and leave you some room to take notes. But we can also send Sherry the online link to this Prezi, and anyone can access this later. So we're just going to start with what we know in deaf education. I can say almost sadly, almost disappointingly, that not a lot has changed since last February in deaf education. We know that we still have growing complexity in our students. Does anyone here agree with that statement? Yeah, we just don't have only deaf kids anymore, or only anything kids, honestly. Kids are just complex, and we understand those complexities more and more. And so I think that that's still happening. I took a little guess in terms of what deaf educators might be feeling right now in 2014. What some of you may be feeling, maybe you're feeling underprepared for your student population. Maybe you're feeling like, wait a minute, nobody ever told me what to do with these kids. This isn't supposed to be deaf education. Maybe you're asking yourself, is this even my job? Shouldn't this be somebody else's job? This isn't my job. This isn't deaf ed. Am I, okay, excellent. I'm hitting a nail. And maybe a few of you are frustrated because you've tried what you know and you feel like you're beating your head against a wall and you're feeling frustrated. And some of you on the crazy train with me may be like, hey, I love this puzzle. I love this. I love trying to figure out the puzzle. Anybody on the crazy train with Christi? Yay! Okay, excellent. Because those are all things that you might be feeling. And I just want to tell you and justify those feelings that's why you're here. And thank you for being here. And we don't have the answers. We have lots of guesses. And all we can say is Nikki and I love the puzzle. And you have several in this room that love the puzzle, and we're all just here to work it out together. All right. I keep clicking the wrong computer because that's what I do.
Is your clicker not working?
I don't know. So I'm going to turn my microphone off now. I don't know if it works or not.
So how many of you are also working with a student who may have a touch of the autism spectrum?
Yeah.
A large number of you. So we're going to start off talking about autism spectrum disorders.
I don't think your mic's on.
It's on. Can you hear me?
Ah, now we can.
It's just the positioning of my... Hold on. Whoa. There we go. We'll see if that's a little bit better. So autism spectrum disorders is a group of neurological disorders that cause some significant difficulties in the area of communication, socialization, behavior, and then also sensory issues. And we'll talk a little bit more about some sensory issues as we talk about the group of ASDs. How many of you know what the current prevalence rate is? Because it continually changes. We just had a recent update back in March of this past year, and those numbers were up to, I'm staticky. Those prevalence rates changed to 1 in 100 or 1 in 50 births. The CDC recognizes, they released that information, but still on their website it says 1 in 80, but they're reporting data from 3 years ago. And so the most current rates are 1 in 50 births. Are you guys seeing that in your schools? Are you seeing that with the students that you're supporting?
And let me interject. I know many of you, many of you probably know Kristen Seismansky's work from Gallaudet. She also just published in the spring the new numbers for deafness with autism, which mirrors this. I think that the current numbers from the Gallaudet study are 1 in 59, and that's from 2 years ago. So we're definitely seeing the same prevalence rate with children with deafness. So.
And we're definitely seeing a more prevalence with boys. Boys are 5 times more likely than females to have an autism spectrum disorder. And so you're probably seeing more boys that you're supporting that have that dual diagnosis or that complex learner. Right now, we have a graph up here that shows what those rates are in Illinois, in our schools. As of 2011, 2012, that's actually old. Those numbers on there are 17,000. Well, this recently we got the most recent data from ISB, and there are 19,270 students in the school system that are receiving services for an autism spectrum disorder. Now, if we think about those numbers and we go back and we look at the prevalence rate, 1 in 50 births, we really should be seeing, do you think we should be seeing more than 19,000 students in the school system? we probably should be seeing closer to 35 to 40,000 students identified. But they may not all be receiving services underneath that diagnostic category, the eligibility criteria of autism spectrum disorders. So that's why there is a discrepancy in those numbers. They also may be receiving services as a primary disability in a different area. And so that's why they may not be showing up in ISB's numbers.
Which is almost our entire population, right? So if your students are deaf as their primary and ASD as their secondary, they're not going to show up in this number. And so you all are here because our kids aren't reflected in these numbers. Some of your kids may have primary as ASD and secondary as hearing impairment or deafness, but how many of you are still using deafness or hearing impairment as your primary?
On their IEP that they're receiving services for.
Is anybody putting it as secondary? A couple? Yeah.
Depends which is
So
more significant.
It depends, and that's always an it depends, right? But so yeah, a lot of this actually doesn't reflect the population of students that you all are working with.
So in the world of autism, we had some changes happen over the past year that you may or may not have heard of. Back in May, and these are changes that have been coming down the pipeline for a while, but when we typically think of autism, we used to think of it as a pervasive developmental disorder. And there were 5 different disability disorders or disabilities within that umbrella term of autism spectrum disorders. There was Asperger's, there was autism, there was PDD-NOS, which is pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, meaning that they met some of those diagnostic criteria of the others, but they didn't fit that perfectly. And so then they would receive that not otherwise specified diagnosis. There was also childhood disintegrative disorder, and then there was Rett syndrome. Well, what they did is there was kind of a lot of overlap in between those different disorders. And so they changed the name to be a spectrum disorder. And they got rid of those different disorders underneath the umbrella. So now when we think of autism spectrum disorders, it literally is a spectrum disorder. There's only autism spectrum disorders, but there's levels within. So rather than that single diagnosis, now there's the single diagnosis versus those 5 different categories. However, what you'll see is the different characteristics or the different ways students are impacted are in those areas of socialization and communication, but the new diagnostic category combines social and communication since they're so interwoven. And they labeled that as social communication and interaction impact. And then they left behavior as another diagnostic criteria. And so now when they take a look at the diagnostic criteria, they only look at the social communication and interaction impact and also the behavior impact for diagnostic criteria. So one of the questions when we talk about prevalence rates, everybody starts asking, well, what's going on? What do you guys think is going on? Do you think that there's a true increase in the numbers that we're seeing? Do you think that we're better at diagnosing? Do you think there's more kids out there? More kids with complex needs, with comorbid disabilities? What do you think's going on?
There's got to be one brave one.
Well, I think it's definitely that that I think we are seeing more, but I also think that we're identifying it better.
So we're better at diagnosing.
Right, but I do think that there may be more in the population. There's something going on.
Absolutely, that we're seeing a true increase. Professionally, my opinion is that we are seeing a true increase. I do agree that we're better at diagnosing. I think those tools that we have available, those screening instruments and those diagnostic assessments, definitely do a better job of identifying our kiddos that might be on the spectrum. But does anybody have any ideas of why we might be seeing an increase? Or what have you heard? What are the theories out there that you have heard as to why we might be seeing a true increase of individuals diagnosed on the spectrum?
Not my opinion, but what I heard, the food, what's in our food, when kids are inoculated,
The vaccinations.
environmental, like what pollutants are in the air.
Absolutely, so an environmental impact. What else? What are some of those other environmental triggers?
I've heard, I don't but if you induce while you're pregnant.
That's one of the newest ones. Absolutely.
Induction, really?
Induction. And the reasoning behind that, I went to a keynote speaker at a conference a couple of years ago, and he did a very, very good explanation of that, is our medical technology has allowed us to deliver babies when they are earlier on, preterm. And so the technology has allowed those babies to live. However, that medical technology, on the same sense, has allowed us to have inductions and to give birth earlier. So until recently, there were not laws in effect that would prevent inductions before a certain week. And so when mothers would have inductions at 36 or 37 weeks, that impacted the neurological development. The prime time for dendritic connections to be made in the brain is between when? Does anybody know? What weeks? Anybody know?
I gotta guess, 38, 39.
You're pretty close. Between 36 and 39 weeks. And so if we are medically inducing labor at 36 weeks and we are disturbing the equilibrium that's going on, all of that neurological development in the womb, what's the impact of that? He also related it back to who talked about diet and who talked about environment. That as a nation, we are what? What type of nation are we? Fast food nation. And so what's the impact of our diet? And he related it back to how did we identify what the cause of spina bifida was? Does anybody know the history of spina bifida and how we kind of have treated spina bifida? Folic acid. And so it was another relation back to diet is they infused the American diet, grains and wheats, with folic acid. And so there was one community that didn't see that same change after we had put that into our diet. And so we were seeing a great change in the numbers of spina bifida after the infusion of folic acid into our diet. But the Hispanic community was not, because they don't eat the same diet that we do. And so then they went back and they infused the corn-based meal with the folic acid, and they started to see the similar changes, that there was a reduction or a decrease in the prevalence rate of spina bifida. And so we can relate that back to autism, and we can say that we do know that our diet has had a huge impact. And so if you take a look at when the first fast food restaurants came about, which, you know, our grandparents' age for some of us, that's when our eating habits really, really changed. And so what's the impact of that on our DNA? What's the impact of that on our genome? And so if we're actually changing our human genome, and then a parent has or a mother gives birth early before that neurological development is fully mature, what's the true impact? And then we have chemicals on our crops. Then we have vaccinations, which it may not be a vaccination, but it's another insult into that neurological development. Yes?
Okay, with the rubella, I'm a rubella baby. Years ago, and I noticed that research is coming up that somehow health complications are developing later in life for that group of rubella babies. Have you heard anything about that?
I haven't. Have you heard anything? I know that
For rubella babies?
specifically.
Yes. Because someone presented her research on that, and this person was a rubella baby as well. And then they said that later on in life they develop other complications, like increased steroids are used to, I don't know, whatever symptoms or health complications come up later. I was just wondering if you heard any recent research on it.
I haven't heard any. That was
But I know that
was
it's
waiting for that. But no, I haven't heard anything on rubella in particular. But that is something that I probably need to look up, because we all started in Deaf Ed back when rubella, those were the students that we had, and that was what we were learning about in deaf education training programs was, you know, it's all tied to rubella. And now it's not tied to rubella. Although I will say where I thought you were going when you started asking a rubella question is the current change in outbreaks because of non-vaccinations in certain areas of the country, people refusing vaccinations for things like MMR, and now we're having outbreaks of things like measles, mumps, and rubella, places in particular in Southern California where we're seeing a large increase in deaf babies again based on rubella because people aren't vaccinating. And so, you know, it's always, it's the, whew, you know, how are you going to weigh it all out? But I have not heard the current research on that. So think.
No, I was just interested because of
Environment.
about environmental elements. So I thought that was another area. Now we're in a
Right.
group, but
Absolutely. And I do know that the ASD community definitely talks a whole lot about that impact of environment. And like I said at the very beginning, we don't have answers, but those are all those possible things that may be causing this change in numbers at this point.
So the vaccination issue is because there was a preservative in vaccinations, thimerosal, which is a mercury-based toxin that is supposed to increase the shelf life of that vaccination. And so since 2004, thimerosal has been removed from almost all vaccinations except for the flu vaccination. And so that was the major hang-up for a lot of people about vaccinations, is because the amount of thimerosal in it was the amount that a 250-pound man could effectively metabolize. However, from birth, we're giving babies these shots. And so is that impacting the neurological system? The other thing is if you take a look at our vaccination schedule, which has greatly changed from the 1980s when a child 6 years old would maybe receive 8 vaccinations by the time that they enter school, versus now, who's familiar with the vaccination schedule? How many vaccinations does a child get prior to being 2 years old if you follow that actual vaccination schedule? Do you have any? Do you know how many? It's like 32 to 46, depending on how frequently you actually vaccinate. There's not a time, and we both have, and I'm sure a lot of you have itty bitties. And so there's not a time that I don't go to the doctor and they're trying to schedule at least 3 or 4 vaccinations at a time. And so my personal beliefs is I believe in vaccinating. I also don't necessarily think that we need to vaccinate at that rate. And so I've broken my vaccinations up. I don't think that it's the cause of autism. However, I do believe that it is another impact into that neurological system that we may not need, especially if there's a genetic predisposition. So I think what we're seeing now are 2 different types of autism. I think we see a genetic, where the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. You can definitely see a hereditary link.
No one's seen that.
Everybody seen that? Absolutely. But I also think over the past 10 or 15, 20 years, we're seeing more of that second type of autism, where a child has a period of typical development up until probably 18, 24 months, and then it's like a light switch goes off. They lose language. They lose that social smile. They start losing a lot of those functional daily skills that they had. And so to me, I see that as a different type of autism. I see that as an environmental impact that's causing that change. So that's where we're at. That's what we know. Will we ever know cause? We know that there are numerous different genes involved in the brain. We know that there are lots of different markers that have been identified. Is there going to be a single one identified? Probably not in our lifetime. But what we do know is there's lots of things, lots of supports, lots of practices, lots of things that we can do to support our students that do have an autism spectrum disorder. So anything else about cause? Anybody have any questions? Anything that you're seeing?
I always feel like Debbie Downer at this point
I
in
know.
the presentation.
Get off on our soapbox
I know.
of what's going on in the world of autism. Okay. So nonetheless, if a child has an autism spectrum disorder, you do know that not one child is going to be exactly like another child with an autism spectrum disorder. I'm sure you've seen that with all of the different students that you have supported. However, there's going to be commonalities. Every student is going to be impacted at some degree in their communication, in their behavior, in their social interaction, and we call that the triad of impairment. So I'm going to put my little speaker thing down. And so we think of that as a triangle. And I think the next slide actually has a triangle on it. So these are the different areas that a child that has an autism spectrum disorder is going to be impacted. And then we have this little sensory thing going on where I have yet, and I'm sure you guys with students that have autism, plus some other things going on, also have a sensory impact. Are you seeing that as well? Have you met a child with autism or a complex learner that doesn't have some type of sensory needs? So these are the different areas that any student may be impacted. We know that autism falls on a continuum, and going back to that new DSM-5 diagnosis, that's truly what they were getting at, is that it's a spectrum disorder. And so you're going to see these different characteristics all across the spectrum, and it's going to be different for every student that you're supporting. There's no known cure. It affects life functioning across the lifespan, and students or individuals with an ASD will need supports throughout their life. There have been some claims out there that there are children who are diagnosed and then their autism goes away. I don't believe that. I believe that we probably do a better job supporting them and that we put interventions and strategies in place to help support where those difficulties are at. Sure, we can teach skills, but I don't truly think that diagnosis ever goes away. And there's that triad again. Other commonalities, and this is why you guys are here today, because you're seeing this. You're seeing that it's a comorbid disability. We have students that have lots of other things going on in addition to their autism. You may see students that have anxiety disorders, OCD. Are you seeing any OCD in your classrooms? A little, a smidge, a little rigidity, like the sameness. Social anxiety, so that social interaction, the whole social world, navigating that social world is very difficult for our kids on the spectrum. And then you'll see some maybe learning difficulties. Depression. Depression is a huge one, and sometimes it doesn't start when they're little. It starts when they're, junior high age, when they're starting to recognize that they are different from their peers in the classroom. Digestive issues. That's another huge one, is that a lot of our students have some major gut things going on. And so there's some foods that they can tolerate, and there's other foods that don't work so well for their systems. And you may see a little bit of behavior based on what's going in and out of their systems.
Sorry, I was gonna, I guess that Nikki and I speak to several different kinds of groups of people. And when she just talked about digestive problems was the first time this morning I haven't seen heads nod. But when we say that same thing to a room full of teachers who teach kids with autism, every one of them shakes their heads at us. So somebody tell me, why is there a difference in head nodding between this group and ASD teachers? This is where my college professor thing comes out. I'll wait you out all day. Does anybody have an idea?
And I mean, if you look at diet issues,
our perspective is different.
I don't know why the two kids that come to mind are very ears. They're like white.
I'm going to repeat for you. She said the two kids that come to her room are very picky eaters.
They'll eat white food, white cheese, crackers.
Only white food.
A vegetable does not cross their plate.
no
Right.
green, no
So,
color.
No color, no vegetables. Okay, so I'm glad to hear you say that, and they're very pale. And so you're seeing that, and my kid only eats this kid only eats white food. I'm not ever gonna pull out an apple for snack. It's not gonna go over. And so you're recognizing that. How many of you recognize the digestive issues with your students? Because sometimes I think we, with our deaf ed hats on, we're like, whoa, that's not my job. Right? I'm just venturing out, because every time we say that to a teacher with autism, they're like, oh yeah. Because that's part of their regular routine to think about Not only the sensory, do they need weighted, do they need brushed, do they need all these other things, but also those digestive choices, which is likely tied to a sensory integration issue. It's not because they don't like vegetables. It's because they're hypo or hypersensitive in their oral cavity. And that is going to impact, guys, when I'm hungry, count me out, right? So digestion and all of those really physical pieces, we haven't put that hat on in our field yet. But I think that this is going to be a stretch for us. I think if we do it together, we can do it. Is that we really have to think whole child. We sing that song all the time, right? Whole child, whole child. But that also includes the stuff that we don't want to deal with. Because it is truly impacting this population of students from their waking moment until they go to sleep.
Because
and it's impacting that family huge.
And what goes in their mouth is going to impact their behavior for that day. It's going to impact their attending, their ability to attend. And so we have teachers that parents have set up a diet with their physicians, and they have to, because we do have white food only kids. There are chicken nugget kids, there are macaroni kids, our white bread kids, our French fry kids, and that's all they eat. But the impact of that on their behavior is tremendous. So we have teachers that have worked with families that have set up how many grams of fiber they have to have throughout the day. And so I'll walk into a classroom and one of the teachers will go up to her TA and say, he needs 4 more blueberries, and then he'll be at his 7 grams of fiber, because they know that he needs so much fiber so that he can attend during the next lesson. So not only is he receiving his sensory strategies, which we'll talk about later, to help regulate him so he's able to attend and take in information, it's also based on his diet throughout the day. And so his food intake is a huge, huge thing. So that's a whole nother world. It's new to you guys, and it is becoming more relevant and prevalent in the classrooms that I'm in. So diet is huge. Impact of diet is huge. And then sleep. We have parents who, I don't know how they do it. I had the wonderful opportunity to have a little boy. He was 8 years old when he came to live with me. We worked in families' homes, and they did not have, I don't know what's going on. They did not have summer services in the school district where he was at. Can you hear me?
It's making some weird buzzing sound.
Interesting noises. That's going to bother me.
Do you want to pass this mic instead? Oh. So deaf educators,
don't move.
Look at you.
I can't stand too still. Okay, so Cal came to live with me during a summer. He came for 3 summers, and Stacy, if you guys were here last year, you met Stacy. And so Cal would live with Stacy for a week, and then he would come and he would live at my house for a week. Cal had some very interesting sleeping habits. Lack thereof sleeping habits, which was fine for me because I didn't have children at the time when he came to live with me. So if I got up at 2 in the morning for an hour, I would survive. Stacy, who had other children, it kind of impacted her a little bit differently. But I got to live the life of what it was like to have a child with autism in my house 24 hours a day for those 6 weeks, multiple years in a row. And it was the best learning experience that I could have ever had because I immersed myself in it and I got a taste. I didn't get to truly see what it was like, but I definitely had a taste of what it was like to have a child with autism as a family member. And so his sleeping habits, and these were good sleeping habits. He would go down at 9 o'clock at night, but he might wake up at 12, or he might wake up at 1 or 2 in the morning, and that's all the sleep he needed. So he required less sleep. And so we have parents whose kiddos don't go to bed until midnight, or don't go to bed until 2 o'clock in the morning, and they only need 2 hours of sleep. And their children are so impacted that you have to have an adult up and awake with them at all times, and so the parents aren't getting sleep. And so the impact of that on everyday functioning is huge. And so sleep problems and talking about how can we help teach a child to sleep, how can we provide them with the sensory activities that they need to help calm their system so that they are able to fall asleep. But that's another thing that we see in the classroom, is that if we have a kiddo who only sleeps 2 or 3 hours at night, what is that going to look like in the morning? They may be a little off. We may not be able to have our typical routine if they are used to getting more sleep and they don't get it the night before or whatever happens. So there's lots of different things that we need to take into consideration because of all of these other things that could be going on with our students that have an autism spectrum disorder.
So if their body only needs 2 hours of sleep or whatever, don't their bodies need more sleep than that? So are they sleeping at other times throughout the day? Or
What do you see? Are they sleeping at other times throughout the day? Yes? So it's like they're on a
yes,
different...
some no.
Yeah, it's like for some of our students, they may only need 2 or 3 hours of sleep in a 10-hour period. Then they go that second 10-hour stretch and they need a couple hours of sleep. And so that's why you might find some students very groggy or sleepy during certain parts of the day, because that's how their system works. I know my own kiddo had some pretty significant sleeping issues, and our pediatrician said just keep her up, put her to bed later. She's just a child who requires less sleep, which was not a lot of fun. But exactly. I don't want to put my daughter, who's 6 months down, to bed at 11 o'clock.
Well, and I also think that one of the things that I think we have to remember about autism is that autism is a brain-based disorder. And while we need, like you said, we need more than 2 hours of sleep, why do we need more than 2 hours of sleep? Physiologically, why do we need sleep? That's where we build our dendrites, right? Our brains have to shut down to be able to grow, to be able to prune, to be able to do all those things that our brains do. Their brains are different than our brains.
Those connections, those highways, those different lines in their brain are connected differently.
Very differently. And what we know about the brains of, we're going to have to pass the mic. It's driving me crazy.
It's this.
I'm a little OCD. One of the things we do know about the brains of individuals with autism, and I know you all know this in Deaf Ed, but neuroplasticity is at its best until 18 months. At 18 months, typically developing kids have this amazing thing happen in our brains. Our brains go, yeah, this one we don't need. We can combine all these together, and now we have a superhighway. So we start pruning like you prune your trees in the spring. Brains of children with autism don't prune the same. So their brains are very, very, very dense, where our brains get really dense and then they get lighter. They get less dense because our brains know how to connect in a different way, how to decide what's important, what's not important. How can I funnel these things and categorize things together? Brains in children with autism, when you look at MRI studies, they don't prune. And so their brains, on a very physiological basis, are very different than our brains. And I think that in and of itself might be the reason that 2 hours of sleep is enough for them, where I need way more than 2 hours of sleep. But I think really if you look at it from a very physiological standpoint, that I'm just guessing. Like I said, no answers ever, but I'm just, that would be my guess. Very physiologically different. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, yes.
And sometimes you can tell when they're going to get sick.
Oh, I'm sorry. So the point, I'm really sorry. I should know that. So when a child with autism gets sick, they're off, like way off, for like a week long. They have a cold and they are off. Their behavior has completely changed for a week. So is that related to their brains? What could that be? Why does that happen?
Why does that happen? Again, I would relate it back to that neurological difference. You can also see a lot of our students with autism before a storm, before the weather changes, before that barometric pressure starts changing. You'll see a huge difference in their behavior as well. And what it is about them, it's just the sensitivity. They can pick it up before. Also, what we found related back to the being sick is a lot of the medications that we would typically take when we are sick or that we would give our kiddos, their bodies do not metabolize that medicine the same way. So they often respond differently, and the way that we treat has to be different because of the way that their body responds to those medicines.
Well, and I have long said there are two groups of people in the world that can tell you when a full moon is coming. Teachers and ER nurses, right? And it's very, very true. And I think it's very true even with storms. If anyone's ever worked with a child that also has a shunt from hydrocephalus or anything like that, I always knew when there was a major weather front coming, because it sets in a migraine instantly when there's a change in pressure. So there's a lot of things, really what I consider outside of our deaf ed box, that we may not know the answers, and we may not read all of this all the time, but engaging in a conversation with someone once a year about it is enough to at least go, oh, yeah, maybe that's something. I never even thought about the fact that it's the worst winter in the history of mankind, and my skin is dry. And so now every child that I have that is deaf with autism wants to strip, but it's 20 degrees. And maybe that's something that even if just once it enters our mindset, then maybe we're headed in the right direction.
So we have that sensory impact where they want to strip because their skin is itchy, but we also have the disruption of their school schedule. When they're used to going to school Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, however, when we're not in school Monday and Tuesday, and that's part of their routine, we're going to see the effects of that on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday when they come back, just because of the disruption of their schedule. So lots of things to consider. Yeah.
In relation to the digestive issues aspect, I'm wondering if the prevalence of celiac disease is something that impacts ASD more.
Yes.
Do you want me to field that while he fixes your
Yeah,
microphone?
and I'll pipe in if I have anything.
Okay, we have someone here to help fix Nikki's humming.
Buzzing.
Okay, so celiac is definitely something that we see more and more with children with ASD. How many of you have children diagnosed with celiac disorder, or do you even know what that is? So celiac is a disorder in which your body cannot digest or absorb wheat proteins. It's a huge impact. Beyond wheat proteins, it's way worse than that. I think people always go straight to, well, they can't have bread. It's way worse than not having bread, because like every preservative ever, you can't eat. And so, but we definitely see that a lot with children with autism. And sometimes not necessarily the diagnosis of celiac, but the recommendation for a celiac diet. And
Gluten casein-free diet or a special
gluten casein-free, that's generally a celiac diet. So, and that again is maybe trying to address one of those things that's targeting environmentally and nutritionally.
Check. 1, 2.
3, 4. Gotcha. So I think that that's what that is. I think a lot of doctors are recommending that gluten casein-free, just hoping that if we can take out one more factor, maybe we can get down to what's really going on there. And I will say this, a lot of people and a lot of parents, it's usually the parents bringing that to you, right? That is not an evidence-based practice. At this point, it has been recognized by the National Standards Project as being a promising practice. And it's probably because there's so many factors that researching that is very, very difficult. But that is not an evidence-based practice at this point, but it has been identified as promising.
Well, what do you think happens? Why do you think families may try that? Why not? Exactly. Parents,
point.
families, when a family receives that diagnosis, we often say that parents hop into problem-solving mode because they want to fix their child. They want to try to identify anything, anybody would. You want to try to help your child. And so they hop on the internet because honestly at a doctor's office, they receive a pamphlet sometimes, if even that, and they're shooed out the door. They're not really even given community resources because sometimes there's communities that don't have a whole lot of resources in them. And so parents hop on the internet, which, they Google everything. And so they will get feedback and they will hear a family say, well, try this diet. It impacted behavior significantly. It helped us, through the hard times. It changed the behavior. We got more language. We got, lots of these awesome skills, the skills that we want to see. So parents try it. And it's an impact on the family. And sometimes we see changes. We don't always see changes that we're hoping for. So for some, diet may have a huge impact. But I think it might be more of going away from our white food kids and trying to get some more of nutritious things, options, food choices into their diet, as opposed to weeding out some of the gluten, if it is truly a true gluten intolerance. So,
We gotta move.
moving on. So these are some of the different characteristics: communication, behavior, social, sensory, and cognition. And what we see is it's a spectrum disorder within each of these areas. There's not one child that's going to be like another child. Everybody's going to be impacted a little bit differently. We have students who may have not a whole lot of verbal language, if any verbal language. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have hyperverbal students who talk all the time. We have students who engage in a lot of self-injurious behavior or aggressive behavior. And then we have the opposite, where we have very passive students. We have students who are very social, almost too social, where they don't understand those social rules. And then we have other individuals who are more interested in what? Objects, toys, things, than people, and they don't see people as social beings. We used to always say that for a child that has classic autism, the hand flappers, the primarily nonverbal, they really don't see the need in socializing or interacting with another person unless it's a means to an end, versus a child on the different end of the spectrum who is very verbal. They just don't know how to interact. It's a breakdown in that social interaction. So they want to have friends, they want to interact with other people, they just don't know how. And so every child on the spectrum is going to be impacted differently socially. And then we have sensory needs. We have students who are hyposensitive, and then we have the opposite where they're hypersensitive. And so going in and trying to identify what each of those needs are for our students is going to help out, because then we can identify what strategies and what supports to put in place throughout the day so that we can either lower their systems or rev up their systems. Motor. Have you ever seen a child with classic autism run? They look like they're flying apart. I mean, they're all over the place. Their bodies just are not coordinated. Mm-hmm. So that is impacted when we are going to talk about different communication strategies, when we get into evidence-based practices and talk about functional communication training, because we talk about sign for our kiddos with autism and how sometimes that may or may not be the best modality for a student with autism because of that sensory impairment, because of the way that they form their signs. Mm-hmm. There it goes again. And I have not done anything.
I don't know, you tried to run.
And then we have cognitive. It used to be thought that a majority of students that have an autism spectrum disorder might have a cognitive impairment. However, we know that that number of students that actually do have a cognitive impairment is incredibly low, less than 25% of students. And the reason that it at one time was thought that it was higher is because the way that we tested students. We tested students using a communication or a language-based test. And autism, at its roots, is a communication-based disorder. So we're using their weakest area to try to pull that information from. And so is that really a true way to grasp their cognitive abilities?
So this is really where their field could have learned from us, right? Because this is what happened in deafness a long, long time ago, right? Where we made the argument for stop testing our students on verbal intelligence. I mean, we knew that this isn't going to work. The field of autism and the general public made the same assumption about individuals with autism that they once made about individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing. That whole deaf and dumb concept was very much the concept tied to individuals with autism, especially those that are nonverbal. And I know last year we showed a clip of Carly Fleischman. She's one of the people who has really just blown people's brains open Because she's completely nonverbal and writes books and blogs, and I'm on her Facebook page, and she's amazing. And
But they didn't identify this. They didn't know that she
She's
could
14.
communicate.